Happy Sunday, everybody. Usually on Sundays, what I do is I go over my best of one meta breakers, which are mythic decks that climbed particularly well throughout the week. And since we had a season reset, I think I'd rather just talk about the number one and number two mythic decks that have already hit in the beginning season here for the last bit of Duskmourn. So, um, as you can see here, Elf Kicker was able to climb to the coveted number one mythic spot last night, and so we'll be covering these decks. And if you're curious what I'm looking at right here, this is called Untapped. I am an affiliate with Untapped, so if you look in the description of the video, you can find my affiliate link if you want to help support the channel, as well as kind of put your data towards this interesting project. I've found it to be particularly helpful in understanding the meta of best of 3 and best of 1, and definitely encourage you to check it out. So with that, let's talk about the decks. All right, so we'll start here with Mythic number 2, even though I did the spoiler, right? So anyway, Jeskai Convoke by Legendary Pai Mei, and Mythic number 2 went 19-7 for a 73% win rate. Took about 7 hours, 3 of which was mono red, and then 4 of which was Jeskai Convoke, and all of it was done in best of 3. And I think there's a lot of interest in best of 3 right now. Just after Worlds, there's always like a little spike because all of the Worlds decks are best of 3 decks. And so I've talked about Jeskai Convoke kind of throughout the seasons of Duskmourn in my meta reviews. It does come up occasionally. And what the upside to this deck is that it's good against single point interaction. So it's very similar to Boros Convoke from before rotation, but with a couple of changes. So since we lost the Voldaren Epicure, we've running the Spyglass Siren, which allows us to get a map token instead of a blood token. The downside is it's blue, so we have to have kind of a more taxed mana base, but still an interesting deck, and it's definitely been, I think you should check it out if you haven't, just because of how good it counters certain strategies. So Novice Inspector also creates the artifact. The Warden of the Inner Sky can tap those artifacts to become a bigger threat. Clockwork Percussionist here seems like a pretty good option over the full Yoshin Frontliner. Just giving you an artifact where you can then sacrifice it to the Gleeful Demolition gives you more artifact targets on turn 2, and you also get a card draw out of it. Mockingbird allows you to copy any card in your deck, works with the Knight Errant of Eos, the Imidane's Recruiter, gives you some interesting targets, even if you need to just copy some of your earlier stuff to kind of get the combo going, because this deck is almost like a combo deck where you're trying to play your enablers on turn 1. Turn 2, ideally you can do a turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos by playing Novice Inspector and Spyglass Siren, sack the token type thing, right? That allows you to then search your deck quite efficiently for the Imidane's Recruiter, and then on turn 3 you can be swinging in with a relatively large board very quickly. The Case of the Gateway Express is the main interaction in the deck, using your go wide strategy to then destroy a single target, as well as then once the case is solved, giving all of your creatures +1/+0. Allows you to push in a lot of damage if the game is a little bit grindier. And then Resolute Reinforcements lets you do a turn 3 Knight Errant of Eos, and also helps with the go wide strategy. And then Sheltered by Ghosts in here, kind of taking the place of where we see sometimes like the Sanguine Evangelist or the War Leader's Call, giving you the lifelink, which is helpful against decks like Mono Red, which this deck tends to struggle with. And but we have some sideboard answers to Mono Red's aggression, like Torch the Towers. These also work really well against the Enduring Curiosity and the Slasher in Dimir Midrange, Mono Black. Anything that's a recurring threat that's kind of problematic. The Golgari guy that comes back as an adventure that I'm blanking on the name of, Mosswood Dread Knight. Anything like that, Torch the Tower is a pretty good sideboard option. And we have Destroy Evil for problematic enchantments, large single threats like mono black mid-range is running a lot of those 6/6 flyers, the Archfiend of the Dross. Protecting the Negotiators is particularly nice to sub in if you're coming up against like Sunfalls, specifically, sometimes temporary lockdown. The board sweepers are a little bit hard for this matchup as well, so this gives you kind of a way to protect against that. Same with the Disdainful Stroke, specifically for Sunfall. And then we've got Lithomantic Barrage, which helps up against the Azorius Oculus deck, especially. Gives you a decent option to bring in. Sometimes I actually like to run these in Gruul Aggro too, against Gruul Aggro, just because if they're planning to play like Heartfire Hero into Snakeskin Veil, and you Lithomantic Barrage in response to them playing the Snakeskin Veil, like you can kind of tweak it with the fact that the spell can't be countered. But really where it's going to shine is against like Azorius Oculus. And Get Lost gives you some more enchantment hate. This is a good one to bring in if they're running Temporary Lockdown, because you can get some of your stuff back. A lot of your stuff is tokens, so destroying the Temporary Lockdown doesn't work as well. But still, if you can get a couple of your things back, destroying their Temporary Lockdown can be exactly what this deck needs. And then Soul Partition, I'm not 100% sure why this one's in the sideboard, to be honest. Being able to bounce something and give you more time kind of makes me think of like Mono Red, where if you could bounce like a Screaming Nemesis to their hand and make it cost 5, then they're probably not going to get to play that throughout the match. So could also be something that's like if there's a problematic threat that Torch the Tower doesn't quite answer, then Soul Partition kind of hopefully lets you resolve that problem. All right, and then the Mythic number 1 list is Dimir Midrange by Elf Kicker, and they went 46-9 for an 84% win rate to hit Mythic 1. Took them about 12 hours, if I remember looking at it correctly. 12 and a half hours to climb to the number 1 spot. And this one was, I think this was one of the lists from Worlds. Wouldn't be surprised if it is, right? But so basically we're running Gix. Instead of a third copy of Gix, we've got the Enduring Curiosity, which allows you to also get value out of your cheap evasive flyers of Deep Cavern Bat, Fairy Mastermind, and Spyglass Siren. So these guys are going to hit in early, give you some additional card advantage. And then we have counter spells like 3 Steps Ahead and Phantom Interference, and interaction like Go for the Throat and Cut Down. And then we kind of move it into mid-range, and that's why I would call this Dimir mid-range, not Dimir aggro, although some people call it Dimir aggro. Because then we're going to start playing more mid-rangey cards like Preacher of the Schism, which helps us further outvalue our opponent by drawing cards. Shielder of the Apocalypse gains us life whenever we're drawing the cards off of Gix, kind of offsets its penalty, works nicely with the Enduring Curiosity as well. And then Urtai Resurrected with Fairy Mastermind and Shielder of the Apocalypse. You can kind of offset the penalty of making them draw a card. So, and then Kaido here being able to ninjutsu off of your cheap threats as well is a way to get Kaido in cheaply. And then this card can, specifically the tempo of this deck, the tapping a target creature and putting 2 stun counters on it while hitting for additional damage. Excuse me. Is quite impressive and definitely worth checking out. So the sideboard here, we've got 1 additional copy of Cutdown for against the aggro decks like Mono Red. We've got the Disdainful Stroke and the Negates for decks like Domain, anything that's leaning heavily into the board Wrath strategy. We've got Anoint with Affliction, which is particularly nice, like Torch the Tower. If you want to exile the creature specifically, then Anoint with Affliction is nice for that. Dashana's Tidebinder works nicely against other planeswalkers. There's a lot of things in here. There's too many to list that you can block with Dashana's Tidebinder, but I particularly like it against planeswalker heavy strategies. We've got the Ghost Vacuum, which helps up against Azorius Oculus, being able to... It prohibits them from being able to pop off as quickly. It definitely doesn't just win you the game, though, because like Azorius Oculus, you just have to kind of wait when they have the Ghost Vacuum and then do it all at once, and you still can get the strategy to work. I just wanted to point that out because I've heard some people say that like this card you can't beat with Azorius Oculus, and you might want to think about the order of which you are playing your cards. Malicious Eclipse is good against the board floody strategies like the Jeskai Convoke strategy that we just talked about. That one's gonna, and Boros Convoke, which we see still sometimes on the ladder, and it works okay against the like prowess decks of like Gruul Aggro as well, like the Heartfire Hero decks. Malicious Eclipse is okay for that option. It depends on how quickly they're able to grow the Heartfire Hero out of range. And we've got the Withering Torment, which is nice for enchantment hate, as well as additional spot removal, but I think you're usually bringing this one to answer problematic enchantments like Caretaker's Talent and Boros Tokens, for example. And then Gix's Command, also similar to the Malicious Eclipse, really helps with the go wide strategies. But against mono red, the +2/+2 and lifelink can also be really help stabilize this deck. And last but not least is Mono Red Aggro by Wildman 101. If you have not checked out Wildman, he has a YouTube as well as Twitch, and I do enjoy watching their channel. And they've been playing a lot of standard Mythic, so if that's your jam, definitely check them out. And you can let them know I sent you. You know, I always love getting a little bit of credit. So anyway, they hit Mythic number 27 yesterday with this after a was it an 8-hour climb? Yeah, 8-hour climb into Mythic number 27. They didn't continue after they hit Mythic, at least not yet. But yeah, 35 and 13 for 73%. So these are all best of 3 decks. I will be talking about best of 1 tomorrow when I cover my last best of 1, best of 3 meta review for Duskmourn, before we get ready for the Foundations release, which is coming out on November 12th? Yeah, so next week we'll be talking about Foundation Brews and kind of switching gears. So this one, if you've been following the channel closely, I've been posting my sideboard strategies for Mono Red, and I've actually been playing around with one that has Twisted Fealty starting in the main. But I'd say this is pretty much the standard build for Mono Red Aggro. Personally, I think the Lightning Shocks can be kind of played as better cards. I'm not super impressed with the Lightning Strike. I call them Lightning Shocks, Lightning Strikes. And but anyway, this is the standard. You've got the Heartfire Hero, Manifold Mouse, Emberheart Challenger, Mice package. Hired Claw works really well for getting it damage through early, and then sometimes you are just gonna threaten with it or even pump it. I've really liked the addition of this card, and there are some decks that really struggle against the multiple 1-drop threats that this deck has. And so we've got Shock and Lightning Strike for interaction, Monstrous Rage for combat trick, which works really nicely with your double striking mice. And then we have the Screaming Nemesis, which works, you can shoot your own Screaming Nemesis with Witchstalker Frenzy to hit them for 5 damage. You can also shoot your own Screaming Nemesis with a Shock, and torch the tower as well, which sometimes you're going to be bringing these guys in from the sideboard. But the Shock, being able to shoot your own dude, makes it so that they can't gain life, which can be very important if you're up against like a Sheltered by Ghosts, or Domain has a lot of those life linkers. Sometimes you bump into the Sur, the Enchanter, or whatever Domain decks that are trying to animate them into large lifelink threats, which can be kind of hard. If they get a lot of lifelink going, it can be kind of hard for this deck. And being able to make it so that they can't gain life off of the emblem from Screaming Nemesis is a good answer to that. So this is what I was playing around with in Mythic last season, and this is probably what I'll use for the ladder climb when I get around to trying to climb the ladder. And my own version of it, though. Lithomantic Barrage, again, this one's nice to bring against Azorius Oculus. Somewhat the Domain deck as well. It depends on if they're running the Zur version. Torch the Towers are nice to bring in. You can bring in additional Torch the Towers against like the aggro decks when you're on the draw. You can also just be subbing the Torch the Towers out for the Shocks, for example, if you don't want the ability to go face, because these can just target creatures, but they also have the exile effect. Obliterating Bolt is another one that I've been playing around with, kind of not playing the Obliterating Bolts, but it works well against Azorius Oculus as well. I just wasn't bumping into a lot of Azorius Oculus at the end of the season. It was mostly Dimir and Midrange. Dimir and Golgari midrange. And 4th copy, Witchstalker's Frenzy, you're going to bring in some of the time, depending on if you've got really good threats for it. And The Twisted Fealty is the one I mentioned that I've been playing around with starting this one in the main because of how often I was finding I was bringing it in game 2 against a lot of the common matchups. So again, kind of for the full extent of my best of 3 sideboard strategy for mono red aggro, look for it in the community tab. But basically, this is really great against like Archfiend of the Dross. So works well in Golgari midrange, works well in mono black midrange if they're running that sort of large threat, and then it also works against Domain to be able to take like their Overlord of the Hauntwoods. Anything that has a singleton large blocker is kind of weak to the Twisted Fealty strategy. And I've been playing around with starting all 4 Urbrask's Forge in the main. It's weaker against the aggro matchups where you're going to then lose out in tempo against like another mono red deck. So if mono red blows up in popularity and becomes the #1 most played deck on the ladder, then you don't want to start with Urbrask's Forge in the main. Like I mentioned, when I was playing it, it was mostly Dimir midrange and Golgari midrange from Worlds. Everybody was trying to check out the #1 deck that won the World Championship. So against Dimir midrange, you want to bring those 4 Urbrask's Forge in. So really kind of tweak this deck to your liking based off of what you're experiencing on the ladder. If you needed any help with that, feel free to reach out to me or reference my best of 3 sideboard guide. So with that, I hope you all have a wonderful Sunday, and we'll be doing these for Foundations. Maybe not the very first week. We'll kind of have to see how the meta shifts. And for the best of 1 out there, I will get back to doing best of 1 decks. But I figured this was better than talking about the decks that squeaked into Mythic at the end of the season, who may have had kind of, an easier climb than at the beginning of the season. So definitely check out best of 3 if you haven't yet. It's a lot of fun. I think it's even a more interesting and diverse meta than best of 1. And yeah, with that, take care, everybody. I will see you tomorrow for the best of 1, best of 3 meta review.